Okay, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for being present to this new space. The space will be centered around Pokrovsk, but not only, and it will regard various forms of shortcomings that the Ukrainian army has for the moment when it comes to basically the vision it has over. Uh, how it designs its operations, how it plans logistically and operationally the defense, especially because right now they are mostly on defense. Most of their quote unquote attacks are actually counterattacks, and unfortunately, they end up. Most recently, we had a example by Sibirsk where they tried a push north west of Kupiansk, and it ended up in tears with two M113s being blown up, and well, the crews turned into a salo, basically. Why this thread about Pokrovsk? Because Pokrovsk, as it stands right now, is exactly what was the end game for a lot of the cities that we're seeing being besieged or on the point of being besieged. Pokrovsk is also extremely important because uh, a lot of cope is being invested by the Ukrainians when it comes to why Pokrovsk is important, but it's not important. It's strategic, but not strategic. So basically, it gives away the misunderstanding that Ukrainian supporters, especially those who have no idea about how the war works, this war especially, but the war also in general. So basically, guys who are there just to astroturf the discussion over this war. Most importantly, there are also other issues. Most of them have also to do with quote unquote professional analysts of this war, especially the guys at Rusi, who most recently published a piece of shit article. I tried not to swear, guys. I swear to God, I'm gonna be the most um, clean when it comes to the language, but that article on Rus is just, I mean, you need to read it. I'm not going to do an analysis right now, but I'm going to do probably tomorrow or a couple of days later. Um, also, these analysts are not getting the point, and they're not getting the point not because they don't get it. They absolutely understand what the issue is. But everybody, I think on both sides, it has to be admitted, has stopped trying to make sense of the carnage and the grind. What they're seeing is just Russians are losing as much, and the Russians repeat, or pro-Russians repeat just the same. Ukrainians are losing as much. The truth, of course, is the subtraction of one loss to another, and then compared to the results both on the ground and on the capacity of one and the other side to maintain this war going. The problem, once you start thinking like that, is that you understand that, well, it has become a shit show now for over 2 years, but it's a shit show that is going against Ukraine. And then there is where we have the permanent cope of 1 million Russians dead, 1.5 million Russians dead, 1 million Russian casualties, or 1.5 million Russian casualties. We found out there are 100 something, 20,000 killed this year, but we don't exactly have all the names. There is a leak on the Russian side, but actually we do not have the source to back up that leak. Actually, our source is a document from a specific unit within the Russian army. You have to extrapolate from that. So slowly get to understand that Ukraine started, and pro-Ukrainian started this trend of going after obituaries and after sources they could use to see how Russia was faring losses wise. And what we're getting most of the time is that while Russia is not faring well, I mean, there are losses. The losses due to the environment, the ecosystem of both sides, are largely similar, if not equal, if not worse for Ukraine. Because in any case, similar or equal losses are bad for Ukraine. I already explained why. There are more Russians than Ukrainians. And if both sides start losing exactly the same thing, at one point you will not have enough Ukrainians to man every position in the front. And once again, that doesn't mean there's going to be a breakthrough because unfortunately, Monkey has, for the moment, limited the maximum advance that is legally acceptable within the negotiation frame. We're going to speak about that a bit later, to be the four oblasts, plus some buffer space and Crimea. These are actually, if you want to analyze how Russians think, these are going to be the only thing they're going to get, if they get them. Everything else, legal promises not to join NATO, smaller army, buffers, all that stuff is going to be gotten by combat. So the thing is, I'm going to make it sure right away from the beginning, the war is not stopping even if the Russians are reaching the borders of every oblast, plus or minus those areas of those oblasts like Zaporozhye and Kherson that are beyond the Dnieper. For Russia, those areas are important because, as I said, strategically, they allow the Russians to maintain a presence, so start threatening places like Kryvyi Rog and Nikolaev. But generally speaking, it is understood by now that Monkey could offer those two spaces in order to have either a buffer within Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, Sumy, or Chernigov, or just a land swap. So basically, you're taking over 4, 5, 6,000 square kilometers that are theoretically of these oblasts, and we're getting another 4, 5, 6,000 square kilometers on the eastern bank of the Dnieper, which is extremely important. And I already pointed out to this. The way the oblasts were drawn by the Soviets is completely nonsensical. And so if you start grabbing land from those oblasts, given that there are at least two oblasts that need to be land of two oblasts that need to be swapped, you can perfectly see a small chunk of both Kharkov, about 3,000, another small chunk of Dnipropetrovsk, another 3 to 4,000 being swapped for the about 6,000 square kilometers that are of Kherson that are beyond the Dnieper bank, and about 900 square kilometers that are beyond the Dnieper. So very difficult to get. And as I said, this is not going to stop the war. Because in order to get all these extra territories and extra advantages, Ukrainians are going to have to fight it out. They're not going to accept all this buffer stuff. And Zelensky came up once again. We're not going to swap territory. We're not going to let territory go. Point. Blah blah blah. This, of course, you understand that is pure madness. There's nothing there that has any kind of logic. The Ukrainian side right now is working upon the view that it has the cards in order to make this war a lot more difficult for the Russians. And it's true that they are doing the only thing they could do, which is extol a price within both the equilibrium of the balance of the Russian military production and the Russian economy. But the reality, as we are seeing right now, is not Ukraine. The reality is the biggest pressure is going to come from sanctions and probably from the attempt to seize the Russian immobilized assets within Europe. As we saw, there was a huge acceleration over there. The logic was we're going to grab the money but pretend that it's not theft. Then now the problem is that the Belgians, and I already explained this, Belgians have two main issues. As a state, they have a bilateral treaty with the Soviet Union, which now is Russia as a representative of that bilateral treaty, which means that, in short, the Belgians cannot deprive the Russians of their investment in a targeted manner without incurring the same in return, but also without opening themselves to a litigation or adjudication case. It depends how the investment was done. In this case, it's going to be a litigation for Euroclear, and for the private accounts that might be in Belgium or elsewhere in Europe is going to be an adjudication because it will deprive those private persons that have these accounts outside of a enshrined right within the European law. So it's going to mostly be a problem related to the European Court of Human Rights, and then probably any other local economic court. But that's still far away because the decision over those funds has been postponed for December, so in about 45 days. And once again, the whole structure of the deal is showing that Europeans are well aware that what they're doing is illegal. Because if it was not illegal, they would have just taken the cash. Now what they're trying is trying to hold up the accounts and the investments. So basically, you take the money and you leave a small letter there, I owe you. Of course, it's rubbish, it's garbage, because the whole point is not to take the money. Once you took the money, it's too late. You are opening yourself to a legal action. As I said, the only chance for Europeans to actually not lose too much out of it is to have a litigation advice which would go against Europe, but which would, in a way or another, delay the full payment, and therefore you took, I don't know, 170 billions, but you can pay over 20 years something, which is not bad. To be honest, if Europeans are on the hook for 20 millions, or sorry, 20 billions for 7 years or 10 years, or even more, it's fine. The point is, how much is the damage going to be? And this is one of the dangers that I have with the kind of jurisdiction that is going to litigate, to be part of litigation here. Because we can very well end up with a situation like Gazprom in late 2000s, where Gazprom was indeed the victim of a theft by the Ukrainian side. Ukrainians were condemned to pay the money, but then the point was that Gazprom, or the Russian state through Gazprom, was singled out as putting pressure on the Ukrainians to take a contract they could not respect, which is bollocks, by the way, because the Ukrainians had a very good price, and the whole point they had was also to be able to uh, get a transit fee through Druzhba, etc., etc. But the thing was that Ukrainians wanted to append the deal. So what they did, they went to complain. The court said there had been pressure to do so. And the very funny part is that the European Union pressures the Russians to have a new contract. So basically, what Gazprom was set up to hang, Europe did it just after it in order to have a new contract for both them and Ukraine. This is the biggest danger I'm seeing in any kind of litigation. Europe is going to make everything very difficult, even if they lose. Um, it's it's the problem with leaving the cash under custody of someone who hates you, and it doesn't matter what people are going to say that, oh no, Europe doesn't. No, there is a hatred, there is a ostracism, a dehumanization of the Russian side, and this is completely normal because for a long time everybody saw the 1990s as some kind of karma of the Soviet Union. But then when the Russians started to go up, the danger that pointed out that everybody started to point to the gas, the oil, it wasn't because of Russia was using the gas and the oil. It's simply because the kind of surplus that was laid out from that deal was helping Russia get back on its feet. And Russia was interested in a partner for as long as there were literally garbage, hobos on the streets that basically could be used for everything. You could rape their women, pillage and plunder their resources, and they would just shut the fuck up because they weren't strong enough, and they were expecting for hand-me-outs and stuff like that. The moment Russia starts to get up on its feet, thanks also to a oil and gas market and also guaranteed sales to Germany and other European states, then you start having this problem. Oh my God, Russia is becoming bellicose. That's never been the case. Russia simply, once they started to have the money back, started to talk about their own interests. When they were weak, of course, they were not going to be listened. I'm telling you guys, just put yourself in the same position. For some reason, you're bankrupt, you have debts, and everybody's like passing you over and buying shit out of you. And you're forced to sell because you need the money to reimburse, right? The moment you started to go in, then you started to be a lot more picky, if not outright bounce the guys back, say, get the fuck out. These are mine, these are not yours. And from that point on, you had what I told you guys, the reversal of the terms of trade, which actually were understood exactly as they should have been, in the sense that, yeah, Russia was back. And so a lot of the bullshit they had done for 10 years, from 92 to 2002, was not going to fly. And this coincided also with the 9/11, which for a couple of moments right there made it very difficult for everyone to start busting Russia's ball over what was going in the Caucasus. All this is a digression just to tell you guys that a lot of the things that Russia was accused of for a long while was not Russia being more or less bellicose than before. It's just Russia having the means to defend itself as a international subject. For as long as they were weak, nobody would care, and they would just get passed over. The moment they could defend themselves, and they started showing signs of it, especially Georgia, it wasn't because Russia was aggressive. It's just Russia telling everybody, get the fuck out. This is my area. Those are my interests. You move your NATO bullshit outside. It's going to be the same thing as you guys. You see guys starting to install bullshit all around your house, and you go and see the neighbor and say, you stop installing all that stuff because you are invading my privacy and you are making me uneasy. It's normal things, you know? And that was not listened, and we had the acceleration, especially with Ukraine. Now, all this is to point out that the guys who are analyzing this war and looking at Russia, they are not looking at the very difficult situation where the Russians are since about 4 years now. They are in a situation when they do not control. I mean, everything is fair in love and war, right? So I'm not gonna say, oh, it's unfair what's going to happen to Russia. Russia chose its format of war, which in this case is a proxy war, given the extreme importance of Ukraine as a strategic staging point for anything against itself. And I told you, and I have been saying this to a lot of idiots from NAFWID backgrounds, is not because nothing is happening till now that nothing's never going to happen. In a certain sense, I'm going to repeat it as I said, for a long while, nobody was threatening Iran with strikes and like that. The whole point with Iran was, we're going to choke your economy. And at some point, that the whole idea of shocking the economy stopped, and it wasn't the economy that was aimed at. What was aimed at was the Iranian strategic security. The Israelis infiltrated dozens of teams and had hundreds of targets. The people who are going to tell you that nothing was going to happen to Russia with Ukraine, especially Crimea, being a NATO base, they know they're lying. They're sociopaths. They're gaslighting you. You just got a huge strategic advantage against Russia on its home turf. You have the widest, softest border with the most shit that you can ravage right away. You cut about 900 kilometers of travel for your missiles. You have all these fucking buffers straight to the gut of the Russian Federation, and you're gonna tell me that this is fine? I'm gonna tell you, it's not about whataboutism. Just do this everywhere. Take a military alliance with Russia, let's say Hungary, and see what happens. We're not gonna start explaining again the paranoia that Trump had for Panama, like it was going to get owned by China, or the almost start of World War III over Cuba. But you need to understand the problem isn't that these things are not going to happen. The problem is that this thing now, the way the world is turning, are almost guaranteed to happen. So once you see that, you need to understand the difficulty that the Russian Federation was facing, and why they chose since 2014 until now to escalate within the violence against Ukraine. But this was a glancing violence. We're beating Ukraine's ass so everybody else looks at what's going on, and they don't help them. It's true that it looks like a mob mentality, but that's what international relations are. It is a mob reality because there is nothing close to the international law when you have to look at it in the eye. Americans just fucking bombed Iran over a situation with Israel. Where is what's legal in there? Israel went to completely annihilate Gaza. What is the logic in there? I'm going to say, oh, 7th October. Doesn't matter. You are, as it stands, in breach of a fuck ton of both international laws, but also uh, the very own treaty against genocide, because you impacted uh, collectively a group of people out of the faults or the crimes of a small portion of them. Now, I know what you're going to say. Like, a lot of people were behind the 7th of October. And I would say, of course, because there's a reason for that. But the reaction from the Israeli side is just the same. You just committed a collective punishment in the form of genocide in this case. And that underscores that international law doesn't exist. It's there just to fucking be used against the enemies of those who control the system. In this case, the West. Or more specifically, US and its closest allies. I mean, it's very simple. There was this proposal of Putin flying to Budapest, and suddenly the Poles say, oh, we're going to stop the plane. We are going to arrest Putin. Merz said, oh, no, we're not going to touch Netanyahu. Both guys are under warrant by the ICC. Why the disparity in treatment? And that's why you have to understand this. Of course, you guys know it. I'm not trying to educate you on this one. It's just to point out why the Russians now fully understand what the problem is. And they're left with less and less options when it comes to what to do with this war. And they're left with less and less options because of what I'm going to actually expose right now, which is how Pokrovsk come to be. And the story of Pokrovsk is something that was a mirage about a year and a half ago. In May 2024, the Russians started a disruptive operation in Kharkov that was meant initially to be a rapid breach and pull that would disbalance the Ukrainian defensive system out of Donbass towards Kharkov. It was the first new attempt on that part of the front since basically 2022. Until then, on that part of the territory, you had mostly attempts by the Ukrainians to breach within Kharkov. So we had the Belgorod incursions, Shebekino, all that shit in 2023, twice, and then in 2024. also twice. And then we had Kursk, but that's what's coming. Um, the Russians understood the problem. You couldn't go so long with what was going to happen in Avdiivka. There was a bit of a stall. The advance per month back then was in 2 digits. And it seemed, as I said, that a lot of the investment in men and material on the Russian side were being deficitary. So basically, you throw that much, you get not enough issues. Just before the attack on Kharkov, you had a breach in Ocheretino. The breach in Ocheretino was because the fight in Avdiivka had cost Ukrainians a lot more people than I would like to admit. And when they pulled back, they weren't organized enough. A lot of stuff wasn't there, a lot of men weren't there. And they were still having this nonsensical approach that I would basically try and have these small skirmishes along the border. To which the Russians replied, as I said, with the small bulge in Ceretino and then the operation in Kharkov. What was extremely problematic with the Kharkov operation, as I said, is that Russians went very fast within the 2-3 first days. And that was powerful. Of course, we have seen some outbursts from the Russian military when it comes to these advances. And out of the dry, they can grab a lot of land, but soon enough, the drones, Ukrainian drones, so the Ukrainian remote control systems would pick the pace and catch up with the Russian push. But most of the time, the cynicism of the Russian high command understand perfectly that what they're doing in the great scheme of things is not important. For the area of the front, you're doing it. But for the Ukrainians, it is extremely important to have all these things because, as I said, the Ukrainians have a huge PR component on their way to fight this war. So what's going on? You make this breach in Kharkov. The Ukrainians initially are shook, but they understood also that there is not enough people to actually go into Kharkov. Because, as I said, if you want to go after the city, you would have to have at least 100, 200,000 people just to sustain the effort. Because Kharkov is big, it's well supplied, it's also well connected logistically within the realm of the Ukrainian uh, road and rail network. And of course, it's going to be a fucking thing to go through the city into a urban combat settlement. So Ukrainians, from the beginning, they understood what was going on. They just took advantage of that quote-unquote diversion in order to obtain a couple of things. First, from Biden, the ability to strike with HIMARS, and then with ATACMS within Russia, because of course the Russians were attacking Ukraine again. Although once you analyze the decision by Biden, you completely understand that the Russians have been in Kharkov Oblast for now 3.5 back then for 3 years, but now 3.5 years, and sorry, 2.5 years back then, over 3.5 years back now. So the whole point of new front, new Russian operations, stuff like that meant no sense. There was nothing there that you could say, okay, this is interesting. This is a new logic. Russians had used multiple times diversion on other fronts, just not on Kharkov. They had used diversion on Zaporozhye at some point when they retook Robotino. They had reversed some gains around the now to be cleansed Ugledar salient. They were trying to push left and right. So overall, there was not a real concern except from what Ukrainians made out of it. The problem is that then the Russians understood everything. Because the Ukrainians are going for PR, it was very easy to bait them into concentrating forces and overestimate the danger while underestimating the PR component playing them or them believing their own con. Now you're going to say, what the fuck is this guy saying? I'm going to give you an example. When Biden allowed the strikes over Belgorod, those strikes initially made sense because they were showing kills or damages over S-400, some long-range artillery, some long-range missile launchers, and it was seen as a win. The problem is that the assets that were diverted or they were made free for that counter operation, especially when it came to Vovchansk, they had to be pulled from somewhere. So they were taken out from the strategic reserve slash readiness for another part of the front. At the same time, you had Kharkov. The Russians were pushing to Ocheretino, so they were creating the conditions to what is happening right now, which is Pokrovsk. So at that point, I think the Russians realized this way before, but at that point, it was clear that Ukraine could not let something very small become big because they were so heavily invested in PR. And this idea that the Russians had would be fully understood with the operation Kursk. And the operation in Kursk would make sense if it had a chance to actually succeed. If, for instance, you are in this 50-50 kind of thing, and the Russians are not moving pretty fast, they do not have reserves, they cannot actually handle both sides, it would have mean the world for Ukraine to actually go to Kursk, have 3, 4, 5,000 square kilometers within a couple of weeks, and then put the Russians to shame and maybe have a chance for the Russians to negotiate. Although, as I said right away when it happened, this just kills the negotiation logic because you just invaded Russia and you're not invading it because you know you have a chance to keep the land. No, Zelensky said it from the beginning. This is a bargaining chip. And once you start with that idea, you're like, but that's the exact contrary that I would do, because if you start having Kursk as a ploy to have a tit for tat with the Russians, what do you think is going to happen? You do not have the force that you are using for Kursk, you do not have them in Pokrovsk. So even if the Russians somehow reduce their rhythm in Donbass and swap some forces within Kursk, you then need to do the same. So you need to pull out. But if you are deep enough in Kursk, like unfortunately it still happened, they were probably aiming for a lot more than the about 800, 900 square kilometers that they managed to grab for a couple of weeks in September. Then you would have to move back dozens of kilometers along the way, and so lose your gambit, lose your bargaining chip while you're just pulling back, because you will have to hollow out your whole salient in Kursk if you want it to be big enough to be a bargaining chip. So the whole strategy from the beginning made no sense unless, as I said, it was first and foremost a PR move, and that was relying on information. And this is something that I had a discussion over with a couple of guys from our side. An information move which is incomplete. This is what I said. It makes no sense to have an operation like Spiderweb from the SBUs if at the same time you overestimate or you underestimate or you completely ignore the kind of response the Russians can actually get you. And as such, the whole bridge between Kharkov, Kursk, Ugledar, liberation of Kursk, Sumy, and then the step up around around Pokrovsk and southern Donetsk is absolutely self-sustaining. When the Ukrainians started to do their shenanigans in Kursk, the only way for them to have decided on the move and then stay there for that long is that either they completely messed up the kind of defense they were expecting, so it was first very soft and then very hard, or the whole point was indeed to stay as long as possible in Kursk, because in their minds and in whatever logic they had or whatever intelligence they had, Russia was on the brink of actually sitting on the table and accepting some concessions or literally accepting whatever decision. But if that's the level of intelligence that you have within the SBU, I'm sorry, then you have a huge problem. Those guys are not doing their real job, which is having intelligence on the enemy. What they're doing is, I'm sorry to say, they're playing video games with infiltration within Russia to blow up something that, at the end of the day, we're seeing it hasn't changed anything positive for Ukraine. And we had this with Toropets, we had this with Spiderweb operation, we had this with a couple of assassinations within Russia, we are having this with attacks on workshops that are producing equipment or material for the Russian army. The more Ukraine does this bullshit, and I told you guys, the more Ukraine does this bullshit, the more ground they lose, more people they lose, and the more distraction they get into Ukraine. And this escalation problem is exactly where I am going to, and I'm saying that the issue on the Ukrainian side that led to Pokrovsk is not as much the lack of manpower. It is a problem, it is a huge problem. The issue is that the people who are making this war are fighting among themselves. Ukraine has a huge dysfunctional military and political relation. And this is handicapping Ukraine to the point that the decisions that are taken mostly by a political committee in order to show whoever partner there, that could be the Americans, that could be the French, that could be the Brits, whoever, it doesn't really matter. But what I'm seeing, what I'm sensing is that whereas the Russians do not have a huge problem there, in the sense that Monkey has stupid ideas maybe, but everybody's obeying Monkey. You do not have the army since 2022 allegedly erupting in the way the war is waged and said, no, we're not going to do this, we're going to do something else. And honestly, you can see the difference on both sides. If you start cleaning up your information field from all the bullshit that circulates around the fact that the Russians are stupid, the Russians cannot do this, the Russians can do that, if you start analyzing it properly, and also analyzing with the movement on the ground, you can understand that the Russians, every time they had a huge fucking headache, they took the hit and they went back at it. Ukraine, since for instance, this is just an example, since the optical fiber drone FPV has appeared, they haven't been able to take a hold of it. And I'm going back to what Sibirsk actually posted and I reposted. You see the attack with those two BTR 113, M113 and M113 APCs. The problem that the Ukrainians have in that attack, first of all, they are doing exactly what everybody is complaining or mocking the Russians for, which is a fully unsupported attempt to rush whatever position. Secondly, they were equipped with these hedgehog countermeasures, which everybody has been mocking the Russians for. And third of all, there was nothing to stop the optical fibers from, sorry to say it, guys, raping them. They tanked maybe 2 shots each. The third went through, engine fucked. Guys were still blocked and they got attacked by FPV until everybody croaked. And this is the beauty of this thing. Everything that Westerners are laying on the Russians, Ukrainians are doing it even worse. Not because it is in bigger numbers or whatever, but because it is in smaller numbers in the same fashion, which means that it is even easier for the Russians to suppress those attempts. And I actually said it from the beginning, due to the fact that the optical fiber FPVs are far more efficient due to the lack of proper jamming to them. You will need less of them to do more damage. And because you have less targets to treat with a handful of optical fiber FPVs against a handful of targets coming from the Ukrainians, you are going to have a full result, which is both assets blown and everybody on both vehicles killed. That's 100%. But you didn't use, like we've seen with the Ukrainians, dozens of FPVs to stop one Russian Tsar Mangal tank. You had maybe six, seven, eight per vehicle. Two, three were tanked by the countermeasures, and the rest was used to first stop, burn, and kill the occupants. You had this is the illustration of everything we said in the thread of January 2025. Ukraine is in the an enviable position of being the smaller party, of losing every single technological advantage it had until 2024, which was they were relying a lot on FPVs. They were having a lot of jamming power as well. Quertus was the Nec Plus Ultra when it came to portable jamming devices, stuff like that. Now, not only the Russians are also adapting their radio frequency remote FPVs, but they're also using massively optical fiber. And of course, it's extremely logical why the Russians can do that with the optical fiber FPVs, because the relationship they have with China. And we saw the difference in imports this year from China of optical fiber, which was 4 times, 5 times more important on the Russian side than on the Ukrainian side. And logically, it shouldn't be that big of a gap. Ukrainians get more hard cash, plus they can also benefit from the Western acquisition of those items from China. Now, where is the problem? Why am I'm getting a bit angry about this thing, and where I want to go with this stuff? There are three main phases on why Pokrovsk happened. And those phases, they are on the map. You go to deep state, you check at different dates, and at some dates you're going to understand how bad it went. The crucial date for Pokrovsk is not June 2025. The crucial date is instead March 2025. On the heels of the liberation of Kursk, or at least the starting of the end of the Ukrainian occupation of Kursk, of the Kursk pocket, Ukraine had a huge problem. They had created the logistical footprint and staging point on the Russian side to actually spill over in Sumy. So, are you going to say, what the fuck is this guy saying? Let me make it short. The fact that the occupation of a small portion of the Kursk Oblast lasted so long, so over 7 months, forced the Russians to actually have a permanent logistical infrastructure within the Kursk Oblast, which meant that that infrastructure being there allowed them to flip the script on the Ukrainians. Kursk, we know now, was huge for the Ukrainian side. We are at over 15,000 killed or missing in action for that small period of occupation in Kursk. I want you to understand the killed and missing in Kursk, when added to the equipment that was lost in Kursk, means that the average vehicle costs about 10 to 12 guys. So once you start analyzing it differently, it means that every crew of every vehicle plus other shit was killed or is missing. Kursk Unlike Kharkov for the Russians, where they lost a tremendous amount of vehicle, mostly because they legged it, Kursk was an extermination for the grouping that fought there. The problem with this kind of extermination logic is that you are not recovering your guys. It's not like, okay, you're going to have 10,000 wounded in action, you're going to pull them back because you can sustain the pocket. No, the pocket was having this tremendous pressure and a lot of guys being killed directly behind the line or in the near abroad of a location meant that the Ukrainians at that point had to understand that once they were going to be kicked out of Kursk, there was going to be a follow-up operation in Sumy. As I said, first of all, because they had forced the Russians to create a whole logistical footprint in Kursk, which was going to support this spillover in Sumy. And this came after the Ukrainians themselves had created a large footprint in Sumy in order to sustain their attack on Kursk. So the pendulum going the wrong side for the Ukrainians meant that releasing Kursk, releasing the pressure on Kursk and trying to focus it somewhere else was not possible. It just wasn't. And this impacted the Ukrainian side extremely heavily. Why? Because by end of January, February 2025, the Russians had reached the Solona River southwest of Pokrovsk. The Solona River would allow them to cut the highway and the railway that goes towards Udachne in Pokrovsk, which meant that one major direction of supply line within Pokrovsk was going away. But by being blocked in Sumy and Kursk due to their own short-sightedness, the attempts that started early March to free that beachhead, that small pocket of Russians beyond the Solona River, completely failed. And if you want me to prove you that by a map, I'm sorry, it's going to be a bit disgusting for me because honestly, I cannot cope with Cope State anymore. It's just not possible. It's not possible because the situation with Cope State is, as I told you guys, the same as it was with the Russians September, November 2022, where they were coping so much, inventing realities, and until end of November, with the definitive loss of Kherson city, so everything Kherson Oblast beyond the Dnieper was lost. The Russians didn't touch reality anymore. Now, this is the map of that attempt on the Solone bridgehead by the Ukrainians. I just posted it. So you can see on the map what I'm telling you. You are at the 2nd of March 2025, and you can see all the blue attacks around Shevchenko, Udachne, and trying to keep the Russians from advancing to Pokrovsk. The problem with this is that if they weren't busy getting hammered in Kursk, they would have more people at disposal to actually fight off this small beachhead, this small advance beyond the Solona River. And as you can see on the other side, Mirnograd is completely, they have at least 10, 12 kilometers of distance. And on the next map I'm going to show you from around that moment, you're going to understand where the problem was for the Ukrainians. And I mean, it's pretty simple. You can see the date again. And I made a arrow to actually point out where the problem is for the Ukrainians. You can see that if you compare the early March situation with the map of today, the danger of getting wrapped up like they are today was not there. So it can be argued that actually the Ukrainians, seeing the map we're seeing, us, which is people who have no idea what's going on really on the front. We're just seeing what's being posted by both sides. Therefore, we do not have a complete vision, but we also do not have a non-manipulated vision. And I'm saying both sides are doing this. You have the Russians publishing footage that maybe is older or younger, depending on their needs. The same is happening from the Ukrainians. Everything is montaged to a point you cannot see the truth unless it is corroborated by other geolocations, videos, whatever you want to call it. So you can see that at that moment, at first sight, you say, oh, there is not a big risk. So we're going to attack Solone and we're going to clear it up if you're the Ukrainians. But then after this, Solone is not cleared. You see the small patches. Actually, back in the day, I said all this effort for nothing, because it's like about, I think the total blue patches over there was about 6 square kilometers all over the place. So by failing to actually clear up that pincer and push them back, what Ukrainians did is all but guarantee that the Russians within 2, 3, 4 months would work up the seams. In May 2025, the 25th of May, it was the other account back then, I told a bit before everyone else. I know that we had discussed about those approaches in 2024. There are people who, when I did the thread over the advantages of pushing Dnipropetrovsk or within the Donbass towards the Dobropila axis in September 2024, had also had the same idea. It's logical. I said, if you check the maps, check how the Russians work or were working back there, you would understand that there was no other way. But there was no sign, because of the information area being completely dominated by the Ukrainians. There was no sign that you had weakness on those positions. And early March, some Ukrainian outlets were pointing out that some units, especially on the Konstantinovka axis, not the Pokrovsk one, were getting bludgeoned by the Russians. And the blame at that point was that the units weren't ready, or they were either not replenished properly, or simply were too green to actually be submitted to such a barrage from the Russians. But those were the small minority. When I did the analysis in January 2025, when I mocked Tatarigemi, I mocked him because everybody was assured that Russia was going to falter in 2025, because they were still busy with Kursk, because Ukraine was going to move forward with its transformation of the structure of its military forces. And I know that there's still a thread app thread somewhere. I think a couple of guys from Timor Criminals still have it. They're going to repost it if you want. If you start analyzing and reading what I wrote there, thanks to them, you're going to see that the Ukrainians are, the whole of 2025, did the exact mistakes we spoke over there. First of all, they completely messed up the transformation. Most of it because there was a lack of men, a lack of control. Second of it, the way the Ukrainians have been fighting this war has accustomed a lot of units, and especially people like Gedar and all the drone units, to something that it should not exist in a normal military. These guys have a complete control over their mission selection and execution, and sometimes they're going to fail. A lot of failures and sometimes they're going to manage. But what they are attacking most of the time are low-hanging fruits and targets of opportunity. They are not for so long included in any kind of strategic plan to make the Russians croak. So when they go after the refineries, they are going against after so many refineries, but yet the damage is not big enough. And it becomes even worse when, as I told you guys, Ukrainians get the fucking payback. And we saw recently that the Russians can't fucking dish it. You want to have no more TPPs in Kiev? You're gonna have it. You want to start having holes in your dams on your hydro centrals? You're gonna have them. You want to start losing your substations? You're gonna have them. You don't want to have trains anymore? Start to lose locomotives? You're gonna have them less. Once you start analyzing the way how the Russians are functioning, you have this huge problem of misunderstanding. Like, what the fuck is this monkey? Why are you doing this almost 4 years within the war when you could have done it from the beginning? And that's what I was saying to you guys. It is true that Russia obviously has a political issue with the decision making. And a lot of you guys think that this is not willing to win. Problem is that there is a very, in my opinion, complicated relationship. Probably because Putin is still a Slovak. We can say whatever we want, but in his mind, maybe still is delusional enough that it's still a brotherly people, or he doesn't want to go that far because he still needs the Ukrainians. And I cannot defend that option. I have defended it long enough. Even though, as I told you before, to me it makes no sense. You are when you fight this war, you are there to win. All the rest, how you do it, depends on how much you can take. So if you let the Ukrainians with bridges for 4 years, then you should be ready to start losing. But is it worth it? No. However, they're still not doing it, and we can just speculate on how, and you can call that cope, you can call that whatever. Reality is, at the end, the person to decide when those things go up are in the Kremlin, and unfortunately the head honcho is monkey. And so you need to accept that option or lack of it as it is. However, the Ukrainians should not have this problem. You know, they are supposed to be the smarter guys. They are supposed to be the westernized guys. They are supposed to have a lot of ISR. They are supposed to have a lot of intel. So how the fuck do these people who have all this intel, all these sources, all this shit, and who are the warriors of light, TM, fail to understand they're being led by their noses? It's very simple. One of the first things that Ukrainian, especially leadership, has over the Russians is that they have this huge chip on their shoulders. This war, for a lot of Ukrainians, especially the nationalist ones, is a way to get back to the Russians, show that, see, we are better than you, even if you're bigger. This was self-evident in 2022, where the gloating was maximum because of the political constraints within the military op, but also with the external aid that for some reason wasn't expected by the Russians. I think the military was expecting to go like that, but politically, uh, monkey pulled a Stalin, being completely in disbelief to the quote unquote gentleman's agreement breach, where I'm not uh, aiding your enemies if you're, you know, in downtown Kabul, and you're not aiding mine where I'm dealing with assholes in Syria and stuff like that. Of course, this was completely mind-bogglingly stupid. And from there on, you have the huge problem when I think Ukrainians got high on their own supply and thought they were controlling the situation on their own. Fast forward 2023, tune is changing, and more what we are fearing from this war, what we're seeing from this war, is that Ukraine is not a rational actor anymore. What Ukraine is trying to do this as much as possible is to precipitate this war into a path that would go beyond Ukraine and Russia. This actually has been the case from the beginning, let's say it like that. And the tomahawks are just a small speck of that problem. The real problem is that Ukraine is going through multiple countries now, having teams over there launching drones from there or overflying them in order to bypass Russian air defenses. And that problem is that um, for countries like Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan, you can pretty much understand what awaits the leadership of these countries once the SMO is over. I think a lot of accounts are going to be settled. And what I'm saying is that, for instance, Azerbaijan, doesn't matter if they're under Turkish protection or whatever, they are choked, a bit like Armenia is between Turkey and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is choked and is alone facing the Russians. And also, given the material aid that Azerbaijan has given to the Israeli state into the attack of the Iranian country, Iranian territory, I think the Azeris have to hope that the SMO goes as long as possible and that the Russians forget about it. And the recent friendly meeting between Putin and Aliyev, to me, felt like that. It felt like Putin, by saying what he said, was washing his hands for what is going to happen later. In a certain sense, he put Aliyev to sleep by saying, "Oh, you know what? We made a mistake. I'm sorry. I should have done that. Whatever." To me, this was as usual from Putin, a completely unfelt apology. He didn't give a fuck. It was pure theater. And at some point, I'm gonna go back at this. I hope fast enough, and tell you guys, see, the same way I told that to a bunch of idiots about 3 years ago, over 3 years ago, over the non-announcement by Peskov, over the transformation of the war after the fiasco in Kharkov. I have the feeling, the way the war is going, that everybody is understanding that the only way for this war to stop as fast as possible is that both sides sustain huge damages. But as I said, a huge damage for Ukraine is a lot more damaging than a huge damage for Russia. Of course, the threshold of pain might be lower for Russia in a certain sense, given they are playing on this completely normalcy of their country, where everything's fine despite the fact that they have Ukrainian drones and French cruise missiles flying through Russian territory. But once again, this is how both states actually look at it. Of course, with Ukraine being raped and the Russians being just discomforted. But this is how also the military on both sides is looking at this. The high command, Ukrainian high command, is a bunch of bozos who thinks that the fact that they have killed 100 Russians but have lost hundreds of theirs is a completely acceptable loss ratio. And once they are faced with the consequences of that attrition, they are stuck into a panic mode where they cannot then properly assess the reality. And this is what happened. Once they failed in Solone, they knew pretty much that by not being able to dislodge the Russians from that lip of the territory next to Pokrovsk, the next step would be that the mouth that's going to eat Pokrovsk was going to go from the east of the city, go up north, and go back southwest of the city. And that's what you're having right now. And if you want to check how things went, it's pretty simple. It's extremely simple. I'm going to put another map to see how easy it was to see the advance of the Russian forces if you weren't a retarded dunce. But once again, for that you need to be what? not Ukrainian, not in the Ukrainian high command, because you were not coping for losing Kursk and being forced to get raped in Sumy in order to deter the rapists in chief, being the Russians, from getting deeper into you. So I put four little maps in order for you to see how the advance went and the division on the seam. So basically, you got the four maps there, and you can check the movement that the Russians did, which was very visible from the beginning. This is not something that the Ukrainians wouldn't have seen. The only way for them not to see it if everybody was lying, which means even the guy from the Pentagon or the guys who were receiving SAR satellite images. And I mean, given how much they have in intelligence, to me, I'm in disbelief. I just put the four pieces, and they're of different dates. And this is to show you guys how it worked for the Ukraine. So you can see that by 15th of April, so when the Russians are already deep into Sumy, you have the first movement, but the area that I told you on Solone is still there. You have just a smidge of blue, but the Russians are still there, are starting to push southwest of Pokrovsk. Then you got the 1st of May, and you see that the advance southwest is still ongoing. It's small, but it's ongoing. And the defensive area on Solone is still there. There is no progress at all. The Russians still are blocking one of the arteries that goes through Pokrovsk. And you can see with the big seam, you go then to the 15th of May, and then you see something very specific. And that is the push on the void that was south of Konstantinovka, directly south on the highway. And also it's starting to open up and go all over, parallel to the axis Pokrovsk, Dobropila, Novodonetsk, and that thing is just moving both sides. Then you can understand what I told you guys after this map. About 10 days later, I told you that we are going to watch a double seam. And this double seam, you can see it on the last screenshot, which shows both an advancement and a start of a pocket south west of Pokrovsk, but also a push to raise this column and advance over the south of Konstantinovka towards the Klebanbik Reservoir. The moment you're seeing this, and you're still busy trying to fight the Russians in Sumy, because by 31st of May, the Ukrainians were still trying to stabilize the Sumy advance. I'm sorry. You should, whatever is your military commission, whatever is your position, if you call yourself an officer, you just should let it go, man. You should resign. You go as a Sturmovik, you go as a whatever the fuck they are using there, but you do not keep your commission as whatever military officer because you did nothing to prevent this. And you can see it. You failed to repel them in Solone. They advanced southwest of it. They now completely stretched your defense, which meant that the Solone pointer that looked still like a salient for the Russians, once you look down, it's not a salient anymore. They have completely opened up underneath Pokrovsk, which meant that that facilitates the logistical advance to sustain Pokrovsk from the south and Pokrovsk from the east. And there, I said it. The problem, but I already had the map and a thread for you guys. The problem with Ukrainians is that they do not understand, or at least they do not appreciate, the severity and the innovation of the Russian way of war. It's true that it seems like it's just a fucking grinder. And it is. It is because, as I told you, it's cheaper to fucking buy a drone or 10 than equip a soldier. With 10 drones, you're going to kill at least 5 soldiers. Equip and sustain a soldier right now for the Russian military is about $32,000 a year. And we're not speaking the bonus because the bonus is already like beyond that. We're speaking just maintaining it at the minimum level for a whole year of combat. And that means no wounding, no, just eating, dressing, and staying alive. And about 4,000 to 5,000 cartridges a month, assuming that he fires everything. So you can understand how much the problem that you're seeing here both sides are facing. On one side, Russia is faced with a bunch of motherfuckers which have like 4,000 or 5,000 euro worth of drones that are gonna stop your fire team. Your fire team, which per month is costing you 2-3 times more than those drones. The drones. I'm not saying the pilots. I'm saying just the drones. So how the fuck are you gonna wage war against that? As I told you, you're gonna have to make it a grinder. You're gonna use those methods to those guys because the problem with the current way of war is that it is true that you are more in danger when you're at the open, where you're assaulting. But it's far more dangerous once there is no assault, but you need to conduct ISR, surveillance, and all that shit when you are under. Because you need to pop out at some point, release your drone. That drone's gonna get spotted. It's just a matter of time before you get spotted. But you, as a drone operator, and this is worth it for both sides, huh? You, as a drone operator, once you get spotted, you either leg it and you end up that the infantry you're chasing, or you don't leg it, and given the fact that Ukrainians do not have control over the sky, they don't, you're gonna eat an UMPK. At least it's going to be a sweet death. You're just gonna disappear. But what if it's not an UMPK? What if they're gonna fucking hound you on your fucking drone layer with whatever they found? We've seen they're using Lemur, they're using Krasnopol, they're using the North Korean shit, they're using Koksans, they're using Pions, they're using MSTIS, whatever. The UMPK is your sweetest death because at least you just evaporate. And also you give job to, the Russian guys who are going to pick you up. They're going to play a puzzle. It's going to be fun for everyone. And also you're going to help your Ministry of Defense as Ukrainian because by the time the Russians have puzzled you back, they don't need to pay your family. So you're going to make them save a couple of months of salary as well. Win-win, guys. This is how this war is going. It's a shit show on both sides. And the problem with this is that for the Ukrainian side, having this drone wall until it works is fine, it's perfect. You risk less men, and the other side is forced to risk their guys to advance. The moment they know where you are, as a drone operator, as your fucking tank shelter, your artillery shelter, your PVD, your concentration of troops, then you're fucked because in the hierarchy of threats, Russia has the top tier. So you're gonna eat an Iskander, you're gonna eat a UMPK, you're gonna eat some cruise missile, you're gonna eat a Geran, you're gonna eat artillery. For the Ukrainians, their biggest advantage is that they can reduce That threat, by keeping the Russian offensive potential on the low, by FPVs, by bigger drones, Baba Yagas, whatever you want. So if you want on the day-to-day threat, it's true that Ukrainians are right there. But the moment that day-to-day threat starts getting pointed out, and for that you need to check footage from Rubicon and the like, the moment you get spotted, they're just gonna nuke you. So the bet from the Ukrainian side that we can keep the front purely by drones, this is what I told you in January already. That thing is gonna work until you have the troops to back up the rear positions. That's gonna stop the Russians. But what you are seeing and what we're listening from Ukrainians themselves is that the drone walls are just ineffective, not because the drone operators are shit or whatever, but simply because the Russians are going after you with the same methods, which means that you need to start pulling your guys out. This means that they're going to have more time to get to you. This means that you are going to be less efficient. So the solution, the problem for the Ukrainian side is that they didn't innovate, they didn't understood what the Russians were doing, and also, most importantly, in my opinion, due to the chip on their shoulder and the great need to show the Russians that they were not as good as the Ukrainians, they kept underestimating these guys. So Ukrainians underestimated the Russians on both how much pain they could endure, but also how fucking deep they could go just to get to them. And we spoke about it. They got owned, if you want an example, they got owned 3 or 4 times by pipes. People are going to say, oh, yeah, spider web. It's true, that was a wonderful move of perfidy. And maybe the Russians should have been more attentive. But 4 times by pipes, guys just using pipes popping out in Kupiansk, guys using pipes popping out in fucking Avdiivka, pipes, Suja. This is probably the biggest sign of stagnation, of not learning your lesson. And there is a reason for not learning your lesson. The reason is that the guys who should be the veterans, who should be controlling, are dead. We go back to what I said in January. The biggest problem for Ukraine is not that much the lack of manpower, it's the attrition, who actually fucks you on multiple ways. First, the attrition. Second, the mentality that goes in. If you see, as I told you, you're a Sturmovik and you're going to lose 60, 70, 80, 90% of your guys. And first of all, you just don't have your heart in place. But the guy who's going to be grabbed by the TCK or who is called as a enlisted, what do you think he's going to think? Shit, I have 90% of chance of going to the attack. The attack has a 90% chance of dying. I'm not going. I'm just not going. And that's the beauty of this that I spoke about in January. The problem, and we saw that this year you had even more AWOL and more deserters than every time before that. 290,000 AWOL or deserters until 2025, with like 60% of that in 2025. Half year or 7 months within the year. That's the beauty of attrition. You can hide it to the guys outside of you. And it works for both sides, by the way. But you cannot hide it within the problem. And the fact that Wallosis is that 165 guys that are not coming back, 165,000 Ukrainians are not going back for sure. That's all of it. This is the attrition I'm trying to tell you guys about. It eats you. And eats you worse when you see some asshole with a big BMW going out at night because he has money to protect himself for. And you have nothing, so you hide on your apartment, your parents' apartment, to some fucking dacha outside in the wild. You haven't washed yourself in weeks, or you cannot have any kind of social interaction because maybe they're gonna get you like that. The problem of the Ukrainian polity right now is that it still operates like it can win this war. And its political leadership is going down with that. And when you start analyzing, as I told you, see how they fail to see all the signs pointing out, and they fail to see the pivots that the Russians were still available, had still available, and were able to do. You have a problem there, because I cannot believe that a guy like Sirsky or whoever is at the top command does not see what we as fucking autists on Twitter are seeing. And it's true that they are maybe forced to make choices they don't want to make, because once you make a choice, you're going to sacrifice one or the other direction. But that's your only choice. And this choice is not made by the fact that somehow someone fucked up. It's made by the fact that you, as Ukraine, are facing Russia. You both know each other, and you also both know that you're going down with your fucking demography, you're going down with your means, and nobody's coming to line up soldiers to help you out. The only thing Ukraine's allies are doing is trying to convince uh, assholes to come and grab 3,000-4,000 euros or dollars per month, and then get treated like, as cattle by Ukrainians themselves. Whereas a country like North Korea said, you know what, I'm going to send my Juche and let's see how it works. And Juche did the job. On top of the Cubans, the Africans. So the problem with Pokrovsk is that the Ukrainian leadership disregards the Russian initiative. They analyze it internally, I'm sure, and they know the threats. Or if they don't know that, as I said, this war is over. It's just gonna fucking last until enough Ukrainians are dead, and then it's gonna pop out. Or they have decided to keep sinking with the boat until they are in such a completely shitty state that then the Westerners are going to be forced to intervene. And the level of reaction we're seeing by a lot of people, and I said, the attempts to now finally steal the Russian money, now the sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft, the sanctions that are going to be applied to whoever buys that, the secondary sanctions to India and China. The fact that they're going with their quote-unquote nuclear option and right out of the intervention, and the fact that tomahawks were spoken about but they're not going to be given, you can see where this is going. So in reality, the Ukrainians are not winning anything. Pokrovsk is a sign of that. The fact that Deep State has decided to be completely a mouthpiece as well. But their only chance, the only vision right now to the Ukrainians is, let's get it. It's a bit like guys who do the draft. They're going to tank the war, hoping that they're going to pick the first pick. In this case, they're going to have the Westerners intervening for them. I'm not saying that Ukrainians are tanking the front line, because they're not doing that. Actually, they're behaving in an even worse way. Because, some guys are going to tank games in basketball or whatever, but Ukrainians are not letting the Russians just grab things. They are fighting for them, even especially when it doesn't make sense. They encroached in Torsk a maximum, despite the fact that they had small holes well to hide. They were getting bypassed and then they were getting smoked out. What good does it make for you to die like that? And then they produce these pieces of shit PR. At some point, they were explaining that you get this gray zone of drones of 20 kilometers, but for as long as you are holed up in some cellar, that's ours. We control it. No, you don't. You are just fucking a self prisoner, surrounded like an idiot, and at some point, you will need to get out to eat, drink, or pee, or just take some fresh fucking air. And what's gonna happen then? They're gonna see you and they're gonna FPV your ass. Or they're gonna just ventilate the shit out of you. There is no control because you're in a fucking basement. If you being in that basement doesn't allow you to actually counteract, it's nothing comparable to what the Russians are doing, which is amassing at some position and then pulling out, everyone pulls out. And even that, in my opinion, is a product of necessity. I don't think the Russians are justifying it as a valid option unless there are Viet Cong instructors in the Russian army of today. But once again, the issue of one side and the other is that one side has apparently decided that whatever they're doing is all good. And the other side has decided that whatever the other side is doing and that's not working is also all good. So when the Russians are going to take over Pokrovsk and then going to force the guys at Mirnograd to get the fuck out, you will have to check the narrative. And the problem with how the Ukrainians are always retroactively changing the narratives shows exactly what I was saying at the beginning. There is a huge problem in the relationship between the political aspect of this war and the military one. I think the Ukrainian military, I'm going to be honest with you, wants to end this war as soon as possible. But the political side of the game cannot do it. Not because Ukrainians are not going to vote for Zelensky, whatever. Simply because Zelensky is going to have to explain why for 4 years he forced the Ukrainian population to get stomped by the Russians, and still he lost the war. And the only answer to that was we were fighting Russia. The problem, once you say that like that, it makes it worse because you knew you were fighting Russia 4 years ago. So why did we need to prove that hypothesis, which is, yeah, they're going to fuck us up? In a certain sense, I'm going to tell you, it's like getting to fight Tyson in his prime, and round 1 and 2 and 3, you are begging for your life. Your face looks like a fucking pizza. But you're gonna stay there because your coach says like you can beat him. Bro, no. It's true, you couldn't. But it's Tyson, Same thing here. It is finally very simple. I'm gonna use a Hollywood example. What happened with Pokrovsk, but is what is happening with the war right now, is like in Batman. You either die a hero or you live long enough to become the villain. Zelensky is that guy right now. Had the war stopped quickly enough with a result that would have been far less interesting for the Russians but more interesting to the Ukrainians, like in March 2022, then yes, Zelensky was the hero, and Russia would have been, honestly, despite the fact that we had lost very little of treasure, blood, equipment, whatever, would have been humiliated through and through, because the deal they had in 2022 most probably would have ceded back in time Donetsk and Lugansk, and all the ground that was taken by the fast offensive in 2022. And maybe Crimea would have had a solution 15 years from there. But we know what the West sees as a solution. Russia would have lost anything in March 2022. Let's be honest. For a long while, I was, yeah, maybe not. Yes, the first iteration of the deal that was proposed to Ukrainians was indeed very good. But then Monkey let it go because things were going sour. And honestly, if we have to trust Western journalists who said that it was Gerasimov that entered the fray and said, El Macaco, you stop. I'm putting the veto here. We're fighting. They want to fight, we're going to fight. And of course, it was bittersweet because 2022 was a shit show for the Russians. Let's be honest. But then things changed. And then the Russians went with their strength that the Ukrainians deride to this day. For Ukrainians, they call Russian worms, but they still lose the same shit as the Russians. This year, when you start losing at the losses, I'm going to repeat something that I've said all year long, it's the first year when the losses are so close in armored vehicles, equipment, everything. And people are going to say, yeah, but you know why? It's because the Russians don't have anything anymore. Maybe. But then that would have meant that the Russians wouldn't have advanced that fast. If the Russians needed to spend like 10,000 pieces of equipment for 2 years advance, 23 and 24, which was roughly 4,000 something square kilometer. But this year, with a lot less losses, or inversely, a lot more Ukrainian losses, because they have less equipment, the Russians, then what's the point? What changed there? And of course, everybody knows what changed. Finally, attrition got to the Ukrainians. And this is the beauty of it. If the Ukrainian military and political power didn't saw that issue, that attrition was finally getting to them in terms of troops, in terms of organization, in terms of assets, but also in terms of money, because earlier this month they updated their budget for 2025. They added yet another $7.78 billion worth of funding for this year. So if I count it properly, the budget was over 120 billion. So basically, their real GDP. So the war is eating Ukraine from inside. More so than Russia, if it is doing that to Russia. And then there is this thing. If it is going like that for Ukraine, so that basically they're getting eaten from inside, then you have a problem. And the problem is the following. Maybe Ukraine doesn't, the political apparatus in Ukraine doesn't want to end the war. Not because they're winning or they're losing, but simply because the budgetary issue is going to become a huge problem. And I'm going to tell you why. Russia's not going to pay. For as long as the war is going like this, I do not see the Russians accepting any kind of settlement when they're going to pay reparations to Ukrainians. At best, they're going to fucking, as I said, just let the money go that's in the bank and go after it with legal suits. But we know pretty well that the amount that is being put up for seizure is way too low to rebuild Ukraine. And yes, it's true, it's a lot of money. Like they're speaking between 140, 170 billion. But it's not enough. And especially if the war keeps going, so the damage piles up. And also the cost, the inflation within Ukraine advances. You guys know pretty much what happened is that um, the IMF is asking Ukraine to devaluate their money, their currency, which means that on short term, um, when they get the money from the IMF, but also from Europe and the US, they're going to have a small gap when the hryvnia is going to like multiply, because you receive, I don't know, 20, 30 billion worth of euro. You get, depending on the valuation, 25% more hryvnia initially. So what it helps you do initially is have a ability to close up the whatever budget, whatever orders were actually closed before the devaluation. So if you have orders that were concluded or at least set up for mid 2026, but they were calculated with the value of the hryvnia of 2025, then it's indeed the guys are going to get shortchanged, but at least the state's going to gain something. The issue, though, is that after this small bubble where you're going to play out the system, a bit like the Russians do sometimes with the oil, um, you are going to face the backlash of that, because within a couple of weeks or even a couple of months, the value of the hryvnia is going to start hurting you, given that you do what as Ukraine? You import a fuck ton of things. Everything that you use right now to kill Russians is imported. Even things that you're supposed to do at home, you need or equipment or raw materials to actually make them. So what happens there? As I told you, you are going to have a huge issue of inflation. And this goes in parallel with, as I told you once again, the fact that you have a huge problem politically to manage the war right now. I have no trust in the Ukrainian political apparatus to manage the society and the economy once the war stops. This is why, in a certain sense, for Ukraine right now, for the political elite, I'm not speaking for the others, keep fighting a losing war is more important than stopping the war right now. Despite the announcements, if you were interested into peace, you wouldn't, every time that Donny comes close to getting something out of Putin, uh, let the war go to where Putin wants. Putin wants the four oblasts, he wants to reach the borders, whatever. By giving him the time, because you're not stopping the Russian army on the ground, what you're doing is damaging the rear of the Russian Federation. But it's not enough for what is really needed. And on top of it, you get the reverse of the medal. But on the ground, they're dominating your ass. So by being stubborn and stalling, you are creating the conditions that you do not need to negotiate at some point. And this is what I was trying to also add. The problem I'm having is that the Ukrainian political structures, they just want the war to end normally, where they believe the Russians are going to stop. They are having this thinking that, you know what, they're gonna grab the whole of Donbass, they're gonna grab the whole of Zaporozhye, they're gonna have, uh, the Kherson they have already. They're not gonna cross the river, and all the rest. Then we're gonna sit on the table, and you're gonna tell them, you know what, Kharkov is not on the deal. It's not on the deal. It's a very cynical calculus, in my opinion, that the Ukrainians are doing, which is they're getting the soldiers killed. Okay, we're losing ours, but at the end of the day, uh, the only thing that's happening here is more damage to their forces. Because for the Ukrainian side, it is to me, is absolutely obvious that the Russians are not going to stop until they got everything that they can get from the oblast they have annexed. So the cynicism sees them let their soldiers die, their country being destroyed, because at the same time they are doing damage by this ongoing war to Russia. The sanctions, the fact that Russia is being completely cut off of Europe for a lot of things, including some flowers now. So we are into that Schadenfreude moment on the Ukrainian side, politically I'm saying, where they don't give a fuck anymore if they win or lose. This was the problem with Pokrovsk. The moment they saw they failed at some point, the moment they saw that the pivot that the Russians were doing, they couldn't stop it, I think Zelensky literally went to that mode, which is, you know what, I don't give a fuck. We're going to play it out until as much as them die. Okay, we're going to lose ours, but at the end, what is Putin going to take more than what he's fighting for right now? This is, in my opinion, the mentality, and this is also the problem why Pokrovsk is happening. They cannot stop it, but it's also completely politically acceptable for them to not being able to stop it. Because in their mind, they already know the maximum damage they're taking. And all the bullshit you're reading about Gripen, about Tomahawk, all that, no. I think this has nothing to do with beating the Russians back. It has to do, as I told you, accepting the L, generally, and just letting the Russians kill themselves over the few thousand square kilometers that they're taking over. In my opinion, this is the truth. And this would explain why Zelensky is completely despondent to the reality. And if this is the case, then I think that Zelensky needs to be completely pulled out of the function. He needs to be thrown to jail, hanged, whatever, doesn't matter. Because Monkey, seeing what's going on and seeing what we saw recently in terms of damage inflicted to Ukrainians, is not waiting for this shit. For him, given that he's advancing with Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, given that he's pushing north of Kharkov, given that he's trying to make all these buffers by himself, means that they had made the same analysis as me. You guys think that we're just going to take the L for the land we admitted we are going to take? Watch this. Russians are not going to stop to the borders. And they're not going to stop, not because they're not trustworthy, whatever, but because they know that Zelensky is sacrificing his people only to force the Russians to take casualties, destruction. And because in his mind, I think, he has this idea that he's going to pull a Azerbaijan on Russia. The complete madness of this approach, first of all, ignores what Monkey is going to do to him, but that's not a problem. But most importantly, what it ignores is that the cost that he's bearing, he knows actually how much of these pigs have been slain. That's not a problem. But the cost that he's being bearing is not going away. He just doesn't care anymore. If they cared, they would have found a solution to the Iskander strikes on training grounds, on accumulations, all that stuff. That hasn't happened. In a certain sense, Zelensky is like the prince or whatever in Shrek. We said like, a lot of you are gonna die, but this is a sacrifice I'm ready to accept. And it is there. I'm gonna repeat. It is there where everybody should clearly understand that Zelensky is not just a clown. He has taken over the whole apparatus of security and political uh, and executive within the Ukrainian state. This is not the guy from Cartel 95. This is not the Kolomoisky guy. This is not the commander. This guy is cynical, shrewd, and it is him who is killing Ukraine, as it was before, not Putin. There is another instance where Zelensky knows what he's doing, is that slowly, the eastern bank of Ukraine is being emptied of people. The able bodies, for of course security reasons and safety reasons, they get mostly dropped on the western bank of the Dnieper, where they are working or they are finding something else to do. While in the east, what is remaining is guys who are forced to be there because the army have a family, pensioners, and if you want to understand why, just take their own data over the birth in the first half of the year, and you're gonna see, compare them with last year or 2 years before. The East is dying. There are no births anymore. Places like Kharkov are cratered. Nikolaev is cratered. Um, that part of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast that is mostly on the eastern part is also getting cratered. Whereas the West still has growth of births, you know? And that's also one of the results of Zelensky's policies. It's not Monkey invading those places and people are fleeing because of Monkey. Monkey is still fucking stuck in Donbass. No, these policies, these movements of enterprises, of businesses on the other side of the Dnieper is on Zelensky. There's nothing else to be said. So once you start looking at everything, you just need to admit these guys know they have lost. But what they're doing right now, they are preparing this unsustainable victory for the Russians for whenever they're going to sign the papers to say, okay, you won. What are you having? And a lot of people, a lot of trolls actually are saying just the same. Say, oh, Russia will need to rebuild everything. There's not going to be people. And I'm like, nobody gives a fuck. What Russia needs to do is not to rebuild anything. It's just make sure that Ukraine doesn't have it. And it is there how much this war is a shit show. Because Monkey has tried for a long while not to destroy too much so to be able to use stuff. But Zelensky is emptying those areas. So at the end, the only strategy that matters is just making sure that Ukraine doesn't get them. So when you occupy the land, just take it all. It makes no sense to stop at Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. If you see that they are emptying the fucking oblast, they are emptying all the east. Just slowly take as much as you can, because at the end, Zelensky might well have accepted the loss mentally, you know, and however we lose, it doesn't matter because they lose as well. This both sides lose, this lose-lose mentality. Don't forget, it still costs Ukrainians a lot more proportionally than the Russians. If both sides have 60,000 killed per year, it's the smallest guy who's feeling it the worst, not the biggest. And that's the beauty of this war. That's the beauty of Pokrovsk. Once you start analyzing Pokrovsk, how it went, the movements, the fact that Ukraine, when they attempted to defend the area, the counter moves, the penetration in August after a preparation of all the month of July, and you see the shit answer allowing the Russians to start investing complete fronts on other parts. And you see also the lack of results because, okay, they apparently took half of Kucherov Yar based on the map of Deep State. Bro, it's been almost 3 months now. I'm exaggerating. It's 2 months and 10 days. And you have half of Kucherov Yar. You just lost to Rodinsky, probably. And they are like taking already half of Pokrovsk. So what's the funny part? When you analyze it like this, you understand that the whole point that Ukrainians are trying to do here is not that much save anything, Pokrovsk, Donbass, and stuff. No, they're just trying to inflict as much losses to the Russians until the inevitable. And this was the point I was going to make, and I just made. Ukraine knows, or at least the political force sees, the political system in Ukraine knows that they have lost the war within the limits laid out by Monkey. But they're going to do it, they're going to fight for it, just because they think they're not going to be anything beyond those lines. And in my opinion, it's complete madness, because by being an asshole like that, you just invite the Russians to follow you up. Think of Kursk. You cannot believe after you occupied Kursk for 7 months that the Russians are just going to stop at the border. This is the mindset that Ukrainians, or the Ukrainian leadership, has, in my opinion. They can say whatever they want. Oh, we don't want to lose Donbass because they're going to attack. Of course they're going to attack you, because you are not willing to lose Donbass. If they're going to take the time to get you out of the fortified areas, they're going to make sure that you don't stay right on the line. That's the beauty of this catch-22 logic on the Ukrainian side. And to me, it's really bad. It's like it's probably the worst I'm seeing, in the sense that you have someone who, up until some point, I thought was just ignorant or daydreaming. No, I think he knows. I think what is happening here with all the distractions is done on purpose, so to frustrate the Russians, so that at some point they're just gonna take the four-blasts and just like cut the losses. My problem is that by doing that, given that both sides are losing troops, Ukraine becomes weaker and weaker and weaker, which makes it even easier for Monkey to say, "Oh, we are here, but you're half of the guys who fought us to get until here. Guess what? We're gonna kill the other half." Then let's be the devil's advocate and say that, what do you want Zelensky to do? To say, you know what, all you guys fought for 3.5 years, 4 years, and suddenly I'm just going to give up the territory. Yes, that's exactly what should be happening. Even Hamas, which probably hates the Jids, I think, more than we can conceive hatred for another human being, at some point when it was they were taking the L, they took the L. They negotiated, and we still don't know what's going to happen. But not Zelensky. Zelensky is ready to go beyond Hamas, the bigger Hamas. Because at the end, for him, it's pretty simple. Once you analyze it properly, most guys who are dying is the people who are supposed to wait for the Russians to liberate, or so. Doesn't matter. And on top of it, he's in his mind, I think, with this idea that spoiling Russia's victory is far more worthy than saving his people. This has nothing to do with the fact that he's from the Fani tribe. No. No, it has to do with him as a person. I think his mentality has gone in a completely different direction, and he doesn't have his sanity anymore. And I'm not gonna joke about coke and shit like that. No, I think Zelensky doesn't understand what he's doing to his people. And people are gonna say, "Oh no, he understands because he's there." No, 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 he doesn't. If he did, he would watch the bullshit we see being done by TCK. Yesterday or today, guys in Kiev bashed the head of a dude who was trying to avoid them and killed him. If you're president of that country and are finding that normal, no comment. If you are not finding that normal, then you should maybe stop the bullshit with the TCK. But he cannot stop, because stopping means killing his whole plan off. At some point, he's going to be forced to stop, you're going to tell me, because there's not going to be enough people to actually cobble together, or you're going to start rounding up the TCK guys and sending them to die. Yeah, it's true, but that's like maybe, 2-3 years from now? Zelensky has more than enough time, especially if, as it has been said, he thinks that Putin's going to die. So the layers of lunacy within Zelio Mario are just off the charts. The guy, um, he's not in his right mind. The beauty of it is that, very recently you had this memorandum of understanding over the Gripens in Sweden. And the Swedish guy was like, yeah, we're going to probably pay this with frozen Russian money. I was like, okay, let's say that you're going to have access to that money within 6 months, right? Right. Let's say that you're going to start compiling the technical specs and all that shit. It's going to take another 6 months minimum, right? Right. So the contract is going to start entering in full power by the end of 2026, right? Perfect. Okay. Given the rate of production of the fucking Gripen, in order to deliver at least 100, and given the production ongoing for other customers, it means that at maximum you're going to do 5 years to deliver the 100. On those 5 years, you're probably going to have at least one average per year. So you deliver 20, you lose at least one just on training or that bullshit. I'm not saying about losses in combat, stuff like that. So instead of delivering 100, which you're going to deliver, Ukraine by the year 5, so 7 years from now, is going to have 95 as the bare minimum. But let's say that they start piling up losses. And by year 7, they're going to have 80. Who tells you that by 2032, first, there will still be a war. Second, you would go out of there with Russian frozen assets if there's a litigation. You're going to say, oh, yeah, but money was paid, contract was done, what's going to be paid to the Russians, it's another matter. Yeah, true. It's true. But in order for you to actually start paying off, you need to wait for the contract to be fully finalized, which means that it's going to be you're going to get started to be paid in 2027. Is there still going to be a war? Nobody knows. So all this shit, when you see Zelio do this stuff, is someone who um, has dropped himself into this logic of perpetual war against Russia, which might very well be a fact. I'm not trying to discuss this, but my other problem is not that much that Zelia doesn't give a fuck about how much the war is going to last. No, my other problem is that Zelia doesn't feel the threat of the end of the war at all. The guy is going to be unelected for 1 year next year in May, right? Right. He doesn't give a fuck about that. At some point, you need to start thinking about, my God, a good way for me to actually respect whatever democratic bullshit I'm talking about is to go there, have a ceasefire, and then have elections. Zeria doesn't think or feel at all that he's illegal or illegitimate. For him, it's normal. Like, bro, no, we're in a war. So, no elections. And this is the beauty of it. And this is why I'm getting through. This guy is completely used of being a fucking duce. And that's where it is nuts. If you want to understand my point of view, why I think what I said to you guys, it's there. The power in Ukraine now has only the war as its perspective. They do not have peace. Peace is going to start unwinding a lot of unpleasant shit. And it's also impossible to have a perpetual war with the state in which Ukraine is right now, because it would mean the loss and destruction and death of I don't know how many people more. But nothing good for Ukraine as a country, as a population, as whatever the fuck you want. But that doesn't matter for Zelio Mario. Zelio Mario is literally the core Ukrotsigani. He doesn't give a fuck as long as he's there, as long as he calls the shot, and as long as he is important. In a certain sense, it is there that you see that this guy is an actor. His ego is so big. And of course, we've had cases when he used the SBU for people who were pointing out that his fucking government was corrupt. He used the SBU to harass journalists and shit like that. We know all this stuff. But the way in which he has no doubt how he feels at home being cajoled by the Europeans, how he has no fucking fear about looking like, that guy you're helping out, but now starts shouting at you because you didn't give him enough money. Bitch, you're a hobo. What the fuck are you talking about? But no, he knows that the lack of uh, perspective for the Ukrainian country is also the lack of perspective for the European continent, or at least the EU as it stands. Those two apparatuses have completely found each other. Europe's future now has been put into this small box, which is we're going to fight Russia at some point. It's madness. It's beautifully mad. And Ukraine comes and said, we're fighting them for you, just give us money. And of course, this is the fault of Monkey. I'm not going to fucking hide it. Monkey created the perfect cope and seeth on the Ukrainian side, and perfect cope and seeth on the European side. Europeans are getting strangled, especially Germans, and the fault. Remember, for a long time, Europeans said, "Oh, the sanctions are biting Russia, but they're not biting us." But there you got it. The situation with Russia, the instability within Europe, the cut of markets, the bickering with bigger powers like China, the arrival of Trump, the whole bullshit that has become a maelstrom for Europe due to the war and due to the fact that Europeans didn't have the guts to say, you know what, bro? No, we're not going to have this bullshit with the Russians. They want to have a war with Ukrainians? Yeah, you know what? Fucking let's sit. What the fuck do you want? If the Europeans were smart, they would have said, you know what? Fine. No NATO for these guys. At some point, you're going to die anyway, motherfucker. We're going to come back and we're just going to fuck you up when you're going to get shocked economically. But they weren't able to be shrewd enough and Machiavellian enough to do that. Everybody has said that, oh, you know what, the Russians, when Maidan happened, they didn't need to do all this thing and it would have been fine. No. 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 That's the fucking thing. For the Russians, it was game over the moment NATO was going to accept the MAP for Ukraine. For Europeans, it wasn't. All the shit that they were starting to put on, decarbonization, electrification, all that stuff, it was meant to slowly put the Russians out of the game. Because, we saw it. You take the Russian gas out of it somehow, you can go and replace it by the Norwegian one. Okay, within 10 years, Norway has not going to have any more gas. But at least, you did what you needed. And maybe a better dude is in Russia, or you're going to manage finally call a revolution over there. And it's going to be kumbaya. You don't need to bother anymore with Norway. But it didn't happen like that. Europeans, for all the bullshit that has been thrown at Monkey, were stupid enough to think that for some reason, the dude who spent a whole life of blowing up people was not going to do it in Ukraine. And in a certain sense, I really think that was due to the very same method of thinking that Monkey had. For Europeans, Putin was not going to do it because at the end, he considered Ukraine as a possession, and Ukrainians are as his people, but, that stupid cousin you never see, but still your cousin. And both sides completely misunderstood the problem. The problem is that Ukraine is not important as it stands. Like the Ukrainian people is not important for Monkey up to a certain point, because I think for him, the Ukrainian people is important. But the Ukraine as a territory, position, and a polity is far more important than all the bullshit that both sides are spewing by Rurik this and Kievan Rus. That no, it's very simple. Huge border, huge soft belly, good enough roads to be exploited, and you get an invasion at moment's notice because you cannot stop NATO from staging in Ukraine. Plus, once NATO is that deep in the Black Sea, you lose a third of your exports in oil and gas. They are completely under NATO's control. Turkey is in NATO, that's sure, but Turkey has a very good understanding of not stopping the Russians. NATO, US, and NATO members are not the same. So to round up this, because I think I went a bit too far from Pokrovsk itself. Pokrovsk, the way it is falling right now, is a byproduct of Zelensky understanding that he has lost in Kursk. Some bet he made. And I think they also realized that there was nothing anymore that was going to stop Russia bar the intervention of NATO forces. And he made the decision that instead of winning the war, whatever he says, he was going to make it extremely costly for Russians to win the war. So we are full into Schadenfreude, and that's the problem you need to understand here. Pokrovsk is the image of the Ukrainian leadership, both the military, which is an ineptitude to appreciate the Russian way of fighting, and political, which is accepting the final outcome, but still making it hard on the side that has beaten you. This is like losing a football match 4-0. It's the 88th minute, and you'd go and break the other guy's uh, striker's leg. You get, of course, ejected. Your team is even worse than the shitter, but at least that guy has no more leg. This is exactly what Zelensky is doing uh, with the war right now. And of course, this is further supported by the campaign they're doing in Russia, and while knowing very well that they're going to get hit back harder. But so, yeah, this is the thing, guys. There is nothing more, nothing else to say. Pokrovsk, beyond the military issue, is also a reflection of how the political system, the political elite in Ukraine have decided to see this war. And the fact that we're seeing more and more guys getting grabbed, put into the van, goes perfect into that. He's going to sacrifice as many pigs as he wants to sacrifice or as he can, just to delay the inevitable. And this is why, in my opinion, there is no much to do on the Russian side. THD is going to have to be on the menu until they decide that it's enough. And seeing them attacking the energy grid, gas processing plants, kindergartens, substations, trains, um, civilian workshops that, of course, also help the military effort, to me, is game on, guys. We are getting to the things that the whole Timor criminal crew was advocating for 2 years now. And it's not even big. It's like we're at the infancy of that. So, yeah, I don't think, I said it from the beginning, things are going to get worse. We're going to see even more depraved shit on both sides. And we're going to see a lot of damage done to protect Zelensky's realm from crumbling right away. And to be honest, there's a very good way to finish this war, but nobody's going to do it because on one side for Trump it's interesting to have the Russians suffer because Russians suffering and having problems with their oil sales also hamstrings China because China will have to choose either bypass the sanctions or defy them and start having secondary sanctions on its big banks, or find a way to deal with the situation, but it's still a cost. So once again, what this is doing overall, what Trump is doing and what their approach is with him and Europe, is that countries like China, India, are seriously looking to a bypassing of the current financial but also political structure. Because here you have guys that are going to take you hostage over a fight they have with another guy that is not your ally in the same sense that you have NATO, you know? And the beauty of it is that trying to bend and not break those two big monsters is going to work only so far, especially with if you combine it with the tariffs and all the shit that the Americans are trying to move, especially Trump, of course, on the rest of the world. At some point, you're just going to flip the table and say, "Hey, I'm done with this bullshit. You can go and fuck yourself, you and your system." And then we are entering a phase of decoupling from the current like global system to a more divided multi-block approach, and that's the ticket to war at some point. And Monkey would be the one who did it. And when Time magazine wrote The Return of History, they weren't sure about how much they were going to be right on that one. And yeah, this is the return of history, the old one. Thank you, guys. That was it. If you have any kind of question or intervention, whatever, it's up to you. I have a bit of time. If you have anything else to say, then it's going to be goodbye. And next week on Wednesday, we're going to have more tactical space because there are a couple of new things happening within the front. And one of them is a two-tiering system of the Ukrainian army, which at the end is leading to the Ukrainian army being a lot more dysfunctional than it used to be before. But also the Ukrainian army not having the potential to actually support itself within this two-tier system. Before, you have the Terror Baron, and then you had the normal army, then you had the special squirrels, stuff like that. Now the problem is that you are having a QRF type of firefighting unit or units, and then for the other guys, you're having trash. And the problem with all this stuff is that the QRF is shrinking while the trash part is growing up. A big part of it is also due to the fact that they are forced to over-recruit in order to keep a small amount. And of course, as I said, you have a problem of attrition, you have a problem of coherence in the military approach of the war, and also, generally speaking, Ukrainians love talking about the generals, but actually it has nothing to do with the generals. It has a lot more to do with the fact that a lot of people are not simply getting the point of the war. And this is why I told you today that I think a lot of Ukrainians understand that the war is lost for what it is. And I'm going to end up with what Krotevich said recently when he actually flamed the Economist findings. He said, what the fuck are these people talking about? The biggest issue is not that much that we can fight another 100 years. Biggest issue is that you have idiots like this that actually post this shit, and we are there to basically clean up the bullshit that they say. And I completely agree with him. The biggest issue within the war as we see it right now is not the fact that they can fight another 100 years war. The biggest issue is that Ukrainians themselves do not see where this kind of combat is leading them, except of course for defeat. And now they're even the hardest of the core of these guys are asking themselves, what was all this effort for? And on that, the two-tiered system works perfectly. The fact that you had the assault core, this bullshit that they tried to do, that was meant to, in a certain sense, from their point of view, Ukrainian point of view, to raise the quality of the average troop. But in fact, what it did is just precipitate, as I told you guys in January, precipitate the average quality instead of raising it. Because you're going to put a TDF or whatever mechanized unit out there, they're going to fail for various reasons. Rigidity of command, lack of people, lack of assets, Russian pressure, lack of initiative. Because the problem also with Ukraine, I already explained, the strategic initiative for Ukrainians is gone. Remember, I replied to this pro-Ukrainian idiot who said, "Oh, what do you want Ukrainians to do? Leave the city, go to a tree line, get fabbed, move to another tree line, get another round of fabs. Yeah, bro. Because you're going to get the same at the city. You lost the strategic initiative. It's gone. There's nothing coming back there. You're done. The only thing you need to accept is how much you're going to lose before you completely give up. And this is where Zelia enters. Zelia doesn't give a fuck about how much they're going to lose. All he wants is that the Russians pay such a huge price that in his mind, they're not going to do a third round. The problem, as I said, is that goes through the notion that Ukraine is going to lose a lot less while they are losing a lot more. And therefore, the longer this war is going in this completely lopsided situation where Ukraine is, despite everything they're getting its ass kicked, it just contribute that if the war stops in 2 years instead of stopping in 2 or 3 months, with Zeliomaria accepting that he's a thief, he stole that shit and needs to get the fuck out from Donbass, he's going to be kicked out of there. So the choice, the deal, as was said by other people before, is going to be a lot heavier on the Ukrainian side. But once again, as I told you, he doesn't give a fuck. Right now, I think he has decided to go like Mussolini. And yeah, fuck him. So yeah, guys, it's up to you if you want to add anything, and otherwise, yeah, thank you for being here. I'm pretty sure that a lot of you were like asking yourself if it was not going to be some kind of more detailed tactical thread and stuff like that. No, because I mean, on the tactical aspect, I've already explained multiple times the problem of the strangulation, the problem of the wrong approach on the Ukrainian side of the war in itself, and I just gave you the rundown on why grown-up people with a lot of experience now, over 3 years of combat against the Russians, suddenly forgot the basics of what they had done for so many years. And it's true, as I said, attrition plays a role, but I don't think that attrition is the only or the whole answer. I think at some point, Zeliomar understood that he had lost the war when leaving Kursk, because I think that was his gambit, and that's what it is. And for the rest, I mean, I hope that we're going to have a thread from the Ukrainians themselves to try and explain how the fact they lost Pokrovsk, so we can start and pulling out the lies. There is nothing better than analyzing the lies of other people, because then you also understand how they think and how they want to project themselves. And with Ukraine, it's super simple. They want to project themselves as some kind of doomed character, a tragic hero that does everything to survive, but actually doesn't make it because the environment around him doesn't allow him. I mean, the usual bullshit. If nobody has anything to add, guys, thank you very much for being present. I would like to apologize for being a bit long and being a bit weird with my choice of subject when it comes to the subject I was expressing here. But yeah, thank you very much for being here, and see you next week for something a bit different, which is going to be the regards that we're going to have for the Northern Front, because there the things are going to get a lot more interesting if Kupiansk falls quickly enough, which means like within, let's say, the next 2-3 weeks. If Kupiansk is cleared the next 2-3 weeks, then we're going to have, other people are going to have a lot more problems. So yeah, thank you very much, guys.